Today's objective is to be able to determine the parts of an expression and evaluate those expressions at a given value. Now, expressions are numbers, symbols, or variables, and operators such as addition and multiplication and subtraction signs, which are grouped together to show the value of something. Now, the different parts of an expression are called terms. A term is either a single number, like 7, or a single variable, or the product of a number and a variable, like 4x. So the expression that we have here, 4x minus 7, has two different terms. It has the terms 4x, which is a number and a variable multiplied together, and it has the term 7, which is just a single number. Now let's determine how many terms we have in the first example. Based on what you know, how many terms are in 2x plus 3y plus 6. In the first example, there are 3 terms. Okay, and a very nice way to tell how many terms we have is that our terms will always be separated by either a plus or a minus sign. So in this case, 2x is one term because that's the product of a number and a variable. We have 3y, which is another term, which again is the product of a number and a variable. And we have 6, which is a single number, giving us 3 terms in this first example. Now, how many terms are in example number 2? 5n. There is just one term in this example because 5n is the product of a number and a variable. So there's just one term here. Now, how many terms are in the example a minus b? In this example, there are 2 terms. A is one single variable, and b is another single variable, which are both separated by minus sign. So here we have 2 terms. Now, in an expression, we will always have variables. And a variable is just a symbol for a number we don't know yet. Now, we call those variables because the value of those variables, the value of those letters can change. They can vary in an expression. So in this expression, this x, this brown x, could be a bunch of different numbers depending on what we're looking at. So that's what they're called variables. And an expression will always either have one or more variables. Another part of an expression is called the constants. So in expression, we have things called constants. And to have something and when something is constant, it means it doesn't change. It doesn't change its value, right? So like that's this blue 7 that we have here is a constant because that constant will never change its value. No matter what x is, this 7 will always be a 7. So in this case, my constant is 7. And then another part of my expression is called the coefficient. And a coefficient is just simply a number used to multiply a variable. So in this case, when we're looking at 4x, we're using 4 to be multiplied by x. So in this case, my coefficient is the number 4. Okay, 7 is not a coefficient because 7 is not being used to multiply a new variable. That 7 will always remain the same. But here, my coefficient is, in this term, my coefficient can be 4. And depending on the number of terms that we will have different coefficients. So in this example, 3x plus 5y minus 9, how many terms do we have? Here we have 3 terms. We have the term 3x, we have the term 5y, and we have the term 9. Oops. 9. So we have 3 terms over here, and again, those terms are separated by either a plus or minus sign. Now, how many variables do we have here? We have 2 variables. We have the x and we have the y. Now, how many constants do we have here? Or which is the constant in this expression? Well, the only constant that we actually have here is the number 9. It's the only number that doesn't have a variable and is not being multiplied by a letter. It's not being multiplied by another variable. So here, our only constant, the only thing that will always be the same no matter what our variables are, is that number 9. Now, what are the coefficients in this expression 3x plus 5y? Well, the coefficients we have two terms with variables here, so we're actually going to have two different coefficients. So in this term, our coefficient, the number that's being multiplied by the variable, is 3, so that's one of them. And in this term, our coefficient, or the number that's being multiplied by the y, is actually 5. So here we have two different coefficients. We have the 3 and we have the 5. Now what happens when we have a variable and that variable doesn't have a number next to it? So for example, what if I have just the letter x? What if I have just the letter x? What is the coefficient for this term here? Anytime you see a variable or a letter that has no number next to it, there's always a 1 here that we never write. Mathematicians are sometimes a little lazy, so we don't like to write the 1 next to it, next to the x. But anytime you see a variable, it could be any letter. It could be A, it could be D, it could be F. Anytime you see any letter, any variable, there's always a 1 next to it if there is no number there. What about if I had this? What if I have negative x? What's our coefficient there? Well, if you said -1, that is correct. Anytime you have a negative in front of a variable, then there's a -1 there that we don't usually write. So now that we know what expressions look like and we know what the parts of an expression, well, how do we evaluate these expressions? We have 3 simple steps that we're going to follow today, and you want to make sure that you are using these steps throughout your work and you are showing me that you're using these steps throughout your work, because they will eventually help us with problems that are a lot more challenging. So we have the expression 2x plus 8, and as we mentioned, our variables can vary. Our variables can be different numbers. But in this case, we want to know, in this expression, when x is equal to 3, well, what is its value? The first step tells me to rewrite the expression and replace the variable with parentheses. So I'm going to rewrite my expression here, this 2x plus 8. This is not a part of my expression. That's just telling me the value of x. I'm going to take my expression, and anywhere I see an x, I'm going to go ahead and replace it with parentheses. So I have 2x, so I'm going to put parentheses there, plus 8. And now wherever I put a parentheses for x, I'm going to go ahead and plug in the value of the variable, as step 2 is telling me to do, which in this case is 3. Now I can go into my calculator and I can go ahead and figure out what's the value of this expression. And now I know this one might seem simple, and you can do this on probably in your head, in the top of your head. It's very important that you get used to using your calculator to evaluate these expressions so that we eliminate very simple mistakes, very common mistakes that are very easy to make in these when evaluating these expressions. So in our calculators, this is how we put in the expression when we're trying to evaluate it. This one's pretty simple. All we have to do is press 2, put our parentheses, don't forget your parentheses, 3, always don't forget to close your parentheses, plus 8, and this is the value of the expression. Now when I put this into my calculator, I'm going to get a value of 14, and that is what this expression is equal to when x is equal to 3. So here we have a bit of a more complicated expression, just because there's an exponent and there are more terms. So this is why I mentioned make sure you're following the 3 steps, and I apologize for the noise in the background, in order to evaluate these expressions. So the first thing I'm going to do, again, I'm going to rewrite my expression and I'm going to replace the variable with parentheses. So I have 3 parentheses or 3n squared, so 3 parentheses squared. And always make sure your exponent is outside of your parentheses. If you put it inside, there might be times where it gives you the wrong value. Your exponent must always go outside. So we have 3n squared minus, and I'm going to add a 1 here, because again, even though we don't see it, I know it's there. So minus 1 parentheses n minus 7. And again, wherever I put a parentheses, I'm going to take my value of n and I'm going to plug in a 4. So I have 4 here and I have 4 over here. So now again, I can go in my calculator and I can see what is the value of this whole thing. I don't have to do it piece by piece. I don't have to figure out what 4 squared and all different parts of the expressions are. I can do this all in one shot in the calculator. For this second problem, it's very easy to make common mistakes, so we want to be very careful when we're putting in our expressions. So we have 3 parentheses 4. I'm going to close my parentheses because remember, the exponent is going to go outside of this parentheses. I'm going to use my caret and I'm going to put in a 2. But if I continue to just write like that, you're going to see that it's going to continue to put everything as an exponent, and that's not what we want. So once I put in my 2 using the caret, I'm going to use my blue arrows and click to the right so that I can bring me back down to the base numbers. So I have 3, 4 squared minus parentheses, again 4 minus 7, which then gives me a value of 37. And when I do this, I get a value of 37. Then last but not least, we're going to do one last example. And for this example, again, we're doing the same thing, but we want to make sure we're practicing using the fraction option in our calculator, putting in a fraction. So nothing's going to change. Again, I'm going to rewrite my expression. So I have -2 parentheses minus 5 over, again, there's a 1 here that we don't see, so over 1 parentheses. And now I can go ahead and plug in my value for p. So I have -2 parentheses 5 minus 5 over 1 times 5. So when you're giving a fraction and you're evaluating something with a fraction, first we're going to go ahead and put in the fraction mode. So I'm going to go to alpha and I have nd, and now we have our 2 little squares, so we can put the top of the fraction and the bottom of the fraction. So I have -2, and now remember, if I have a negative, I'm not using a minus sign for that. I'm using the negative symbol under 3. So I have -2 parentheses 5. Now this is a minus, so I'm going to use the minus under the x, under the times. So I have -5. And now again, I can use my blue arrows to go down, or I can tap it. I'm going to use the arrows and go down. And I'm going to put my 1 parentheses 5. And when I click enter, it gives me a value of -3. And when I plug this into my calculator, I get a value of -3. So just make sure you're following these 3 steps. Make sure when you're submitting your work, I must see you rewriting your expression, I must see your parentheses, and I must see the value that you're plugging in order to get full credit for your work. Follow these 3 steps, plug it into your calculator, make sure you're being careful with what you're putting into your calculator, and then give me the value of the expression.